Welcome to Lasea class. I am your teacher, Jan Lasea.
Ladies and gentlemen, a blessed day to everyone. This is my seventh lecture on our subject, ITE 124, Event-Driven Programming. In my previous lecture, I explained the graphics programming in C# using GDI plus API. I presented the different basic drawing commands, the two types of drawing programmatically, and the animation loop. Also, I presented and demonstrated using Visual Studio IDE, the drawing and animation by programming. Today, we are going to learn the Data Grid View GUI control. The Data Grid View provides a powerful and flexible way to display data in a tabular format. You can use the Data Grid View control to show read-only views of a small amount of data, or you can scale it to show editable views of very large sets of data. Data Grid View versus List View. The Data Grid View, it can be used on both editable and read-only views, while the List View, it can only be used as a read-only view. Set up a dynamic data grid view. The following codes will create a dynamic data grid view during runtime. The data grid view control is placed onto the Windows Form client rectangle from the toolbox. The default object name of the data grid view control is data grid view 1. To set up the data grid view, we need first to clear the rows of the data grid view by calling this command data grid view 1.rows.clear. After that, we will going to clear the columns of the data grid view by calling data grid view 1.columns.clear. And we can set up the cursor hand, the selection mode, row header select, allow user to add rows, true, allow user to delete rows, true. The next following code will set up the number of columns of the data grid view. For example, I'm going to design the data grid view having 4 columns, namely location, latitude, longitude, volume, and every column has a indicated index. The first column has an index of 0, the second column has an index of 1, and so on. To indicate the number of columns, we will supply or set the value to the column count property. Here in this example, it is 4. After that, we will name the column header by calling this command, referencing the object name data grid view 1.columns, specify the index. For example, the first column has an index of 0, and then setting it up the property name, and then providing now a string. For example, the header column string for the first column at index 0 is location, and then the next column latitude, longitude, and volume. The next following codes will set the columns width. For example, I'm going to specify a width for the first column at index 0, a width of 200 units. Therefore, we write this command. We reference the object name, data grid view 1, and then set up the property array columns at index 0, the subproperty with a value 200 units. The second width, The second column's width will be 150. The third column's width is 150. And then finally, the fourth column's width is 150. Add combo box in the data grid view. The following code will going to place or add a combo box beside the column name volume. To set up the placement of a combo box in the data grid view, we need to write this following code. We will instantiate an object, namely, we name it CMB select data using the class data grid view combo box column. And then followed by, we set up the display style to combo box. The name of the header of the combo box is select data. We specify the maximum drop-down items, which is 4, but this maximum drop-down items, it is not followed exactly based on my experiment whenever I run it, and then I click the drop-down button, and then I count the maximum drop-down items, it is 5. It does not follow exactly the number of max drop-down items that you specify. And then followed by the drop-down width 160, the width 160, the plot style is flat. The next following code will populate the combo box by calling the method add on that object items of the object name CMB select data. And then I added the following list of values: true, false, my full name, La Union, Burgos, and it will be listed on the combo box as values to be selected. The last code will going now to add or place the combo box, namely CMB select data, into the data grid view by calling this command referencing the object name data grid view 1 dot columns dot method add, and then we supply the argument object CMB select data. Add button in the data grid view. We can also place a button command into the data grid view, and the following code will perform that adding of button in the data grid view. We instantiate an object using the class data grid view column, and then I name that object btn delete row, followed by we set up the name property btn delete row, which is a string. The name property is very important that you need to remember the name that you supplied or baptized, so that in the event cell click event, we will reference the name btn delete row to indicate, so that we can write a code to determine if the user click this delete button or not. Next to that, we will supply the text caption property, and I name that delete, and it will display as a caption for the delete button, followed by use column text for button value true, auto size mode, all cells, flat style, standard, cell template, style that back color, honeydew background color. To add the button on the data grid view, we call this command. We reference the object name data grid view1 dot columns, and then the method add, and then we pass an argument, which is the object btn delete row. Data grid views cell click event. The data grid views cell click event is triggered to run by the CPU every time you click the columns cell. The data grid views cell click event handler method is where you place the codes to determine if the user clicked the button delete on the data grid view or not. For example, the decision statement condition if data grid view one dot columns e period column index period name is equal to the string name btn delete row is true. If it is true, then the button delete is clicked by the user. Note that I named the button's name btn delete row that I added in the data grid view in the previous slide. If we go back to the previous slide, I named the name property btn delete row. It is very important that you remember what is the supplied name of that newly added button so that in the cell click event, we will reference the name and then write a code to perform an action every time the user click the delete button. If the user click the delete row button on the data grid view, we will perform this evaluation of the condition if data grid view one dot rows dot count not equal to 0. The count property indicates the number of rows added into the data grid view. Next to that, the sub decision statement if data grid view one dot current row dot index not equal to -1. The property index indicate the current column number of the row where you click the delete button. And we need to compare if it is not equal to -1. The value of -1 means that the data grid view has no yet uh, rows of data. And we also compare data grid view one dot rows, data grid view one dot current row dot index is new row is equal to false. The property is new row. It is a status of the new row if it is committed or not yet. If it is committed, that means that the row of data that you entered is already accepted and it indicates a value status of a false. If it is not accepted yet to that status is new row, therefore it is a value of true, not yet accepted or committed. If in case it is a value false for the property is new row and then the index is not equal to -1 connected by the logical end and it is true, therefore the CPU will going to execute this following code. The code here, I demonstrated a code how to get the value of a certain column. For example, I'm going to retrieve the value of the first column, which is location, that has a value Burgos La Union. To do that, we will declare a string variable. I name it backup value, and then I wrote this code. We will uh, data type cast the parameter object sender into a data grid view, and then we reference the rows. We indicate e that row index, the current row, and then we reference the array name cells. The cell is a column data, and then we supply the index. For example, I'm going to retrieve the first column, which is location, that has a value of Burgos La Union, so I specify index 0. The property value is where it stored that value Burgos La Union, and we will going to uh, reference it, and we will convert it into a string calling the method to string. Therefore, this variable backup value contains the string Burgos La Union. to, if we wanted to modify the value of a column, for example, I'm going to replace that Burgos the onion to the string delete me. This is a demonstration code, the next code, and we will going to data type cast the object sender, convert it into a data grid view, and then we reference the array name rows, indicate the array index, E period row index. We reference the array cells at index 0, the first column, which is location, and then we uh, reference the property value and then supply a string, a new value or updated string. For example, the string delete me. These two lines of code demonstrate how to get or retrieve any columns value that you wanted to retrieve. You need to supply the correct index 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on. And then the next code will demonstrate how to change or update or modify the columns value. After that, we will going to write a code that will display a message box that it will ask the user, do you want to delete the current selected row? Yes or no. This following code will perform that command, and then if the response is yes, therefore it will delete that current selected row. The command that will delete the row is this command. We reference the object name data grid v1 period rows period remove at, and then we supply an argument value data grid v1 dot current row dot index. If the user click the no, it will put back the original value of that location value since we back up the value, and this is the command that will place back the original value. We data type cast or convert that object sender into a data grid view, and then rows at e row index dot cells at index 0 that value is equal to the string value variable string backup value. Data grid views row enter event. The data grid views row enter event is triggered to run by the CPU when you navigate the next row or any row by mouse click. You can place codes here and access the contents of the row. For example, the following codes will retrieve the location at cell at index 0, uh, latitude at cell at index 1, longitude at cell at index 2, volume at cell at index 3, and data at cell at index 4, and displays it into a message box. If I click the first row, I left click anywhere on the column of the first row, the CPU will run the code inside the row enter event method handler. And then it will run this following code. I declared string variables, namely location, latitude, longitude, volume, and data, and I initialize them to all none. And then we will evaluate a condition uh, by comparing the value at index 0 of the array cells if it is not equal to null. We need to compare it if it is null or not, because sometimes we did not place a value to any columns data of the row, so that it will not trigger a runtime error. So we need to compare if the value at that index of the array cells is not equal to null. If it is not equal to null and it has a value, we will retrieve that value. And this is the example code to retrieve the value of the location, latitude, longitude, volume, and data. For example, if I wanted to write the code to get the location value, so I write this code location is equal to the data type casting of the sender to become a data grid view. Dot rows at index e row index dot cells at index 0. The index of this first column name location is index 0. We retrieve the value and convert it into a string, and it will be stored to that variable string location. After we retrieve the location, latitude, longitude, volume data, we will concatenate those string variables and then store it into this string variable value. And then we call the message box.show, and it will display this message box that the user click any column in the row, and it will retrieve the row's data and display it like this. Get the rows of data grid view. There is a command button, get rows, that I place on the form, which is not part of the data grid view control. The purpose of this button is to retrieve all the rows of records of the data grid view and display each row of record using message box. The for each loop will repeat as long as there exists a row containing a data. If I click this button, Get Rows, the CP will enter the uh, method click event of the object btn get rows, and then the CPU will compare the count if it is not equal to 0. And if it is not equal to 0, the for each loop will repeat, and it will access all the rows of the data grid view and then retrieve the columns, location, latitude, longitude, volume, and select data, and then display them in a message box. And then it will repeat and move to the next row if there is a next second row, and retrieve the columns of that next row and display in a message box. Ladies and gentlemen, let me show you the Windows Form app .NET framework that I made applying the data grid view GUI control. In this Windows application, inside the Windows form, I place a data grid view, which is this one, and then I place also some buttons, namely get rows, delete button, create button, in a table layout panel. In the toolbox, you drag and drop the data grid view, which is this GUI control, to the Windows form. To bind a cell click event handler onto the data grid view, I right click the data grid view and then select the properties, click this event button um, on the properties panel, and then scroll and find the event cell click event, and then double click it, and then write the code that will perform something whenever the user click within the data grid view. For instance, we write the code to determine if the user click the delete button on to that data grid view that I explained a while ago. And this is the code that will do that to delete a row. Let us go back to the form design. I right click again the data grid view and then click properties, the event handler, row enter. To bind code to the row enter, we need to locate that row enter event handler and then double click it and then write the code that will perform something whenever the user click any columns in any row. For example, this code will retrieve the columns values of that selected row and then display it in a message box that I explained a while ago. Let us go inside the uh, default constructor of the class name form1. In the default constructor of the class form1, I explained that we need first to set up the data grid view. And here are the following codes that I explained in my previous lecture, that it will clear all the rows, clear all columns, set up the cursor selection mode, allow user to add rows, allow user to delete rows, and then set up the number of columns of the data grid view, set up the columns width, and then add a combo box, populate the combo box, and then add a command button that it will delete the row. Let us run and test. Let us add a row. For example, in the first row, I left click it and you notice that there is a message box that appears as a feedback whenever I click that column, and it triggers, the CPU triggers to run the row enter event handler of the data grid view. And then the message box is empty because it has no yet values in it. So I click the OK button and then type a value, for example, Busla Onion, latitude, for example, longitude, volume. I left click this drop down button and then select true. Let us add another row. For example, I left click the second row and it triggered the CPU to run the row enter event. I type, if I click any column within the first row, it will trigger the CPU to run the code of the row enter event, and it will display a message box that it retrieve the values of the location, latitude, longitude, volume, select data of the first row, and it will indicate that it is at row at index 0. If I select the second row and I left click anywhere on the columns, the CPU will trigger to run the row enter event, and it will retrieve all the columns of the second row and display it in a message box. Also, it will indicate that the row that was selected is at index 1. If I click the delete button onto that second row, the cell click event was triggered to run by the CPU, and the code that I placed there, which is a code to display a message box asking the user, do you want to delete the current selected row? And if I choose yes, the second row was deleted, And then what happens next is that the row enter event was triggered to run by the CPU because the current row went to the first row and it retrieves all of this column and display it in a message box. You click the delete button. Next to that, I'm going to add again the second row. Let us retype again the value of the second row. I click this button, get rows, and it will retrieve all the rows and uh, display a message box containing the columns, values of that row. Here in this case, since it has a for each loop, it will repeat one at a time and it will display a message box for the first row at row 0 containing these values. And if I click OK, it will repeat again and it will retrieve the contents of the second row and then display it in a message box at index 1. And it had repeated two iterations of the for each loop. The button create button will create a dynamic data grid view. It will erase the entire rows and columns of the current data grid view. And if I click it, so the previous contents of the data grid view was erased and a new row values was placed containing 4 rows. And the code that performed that, we will going to close the Windows application. The code that will create dynamically a data grid view is this code, the btn create click, and it will clear the contents of the rows, clear the contents of the column, set up the cursor selection mode, allow user to add rows through, allow user to delete rows. We set up the number of columns and then the header names and then the width of every column. Next to that, we place a combo box. We supply values for the list of the combo box. And then next to that, we added a button, btn delete row. And then next to that, we add a row. This is the code how to add a row dynamically. And this is the next code that will add the second row at row 1, the third row at row 2, and the fourth row at row 3, at index 3. In your laboratory exercise, for set A, you will solve that problem, and the problem for set A is like this. You create a Windows app.NET Framework application that applies the data grid view, and then the contents of the data grid view, it has these columns, namely degree, minute, second, decimal. It has two buttons, convert to decimal, delete row. For example, I type a value for the degree, minute, and then second. And if I click the convert, it will convert the degree, minute, second to decimal, and it will display into this column decimal. Also, if I click the delete button, it will prompt me, do you want to delete the current row? If I click yes, it will delete the current row. For set B, you will solve this problem, decimal to degree, minute, second conversion. And then you need to apply the data grid view. The following columns that you need to set up for the data grid view are latitude, degree, mean, minute, second, longitude, degree, mean, second, convert latitude to degree, mean, second button, convert longitude to degree, minute, second button, and then the delete row. For example, I type the latitude decimal, and then I type the longitude uh, decimal. I click the convert latitude to degree, minute, second, and it will convert to degree, minute, second, and it will display here. The starting value is north 16 degrees 34 minutes 59.32937 seconds. If I click the convert longitude to degree, minute, second, it will display here. The beginning line is north 120 degrees 42 minutes 0.73059 seconds. And if I click the delete button, it will prompt me, do you want to delete the current selected row? If I click yes, it will delete the current select row. I posted your seventh assignment in our Google Classroom. Please answer and accomplish it.
That ends our topic for today. I hope you are inspired in my class. Thank you for watching. God bless us.